Hello everyone, today I want to travel back in time to the far gone era of the 1990s. That might be a long time ago, but that was my era. That was when I was a kid. I grew up in the 90s. That's right, I'm a 90s kid. Now, not too long ago, I uploaded a video on this channel about the 90s. It was written by ChatGPT, and I was basically asking it for video ideas about cartoons from the 90s. One of its suggestions was a video about the evolution of animation starting from the 90s to today, which you can watch on this channel by clicking on the card above. It was an interesting idea, but it felt so arbitrarily weird to start this history lesson in the 90s. Animation's been around for much longer than that. The 90s is a weird starting point. But the more I thought back about the 90s and what it brought us in the realm of animation, the more I realized how much of a pivotal era the 90s were for animation. So in this video, I want to discuss how important the 90s were to animation, how much changed animation for the better, and why the 90s might very well have been the best decade to be a kid watching cartoons. Without further ado, let's get started. Bring on the transition. Ba-whoop! And here we are to talk about animation in the 90s. We need to talk about it in two fronts, films and television. First, we're going to talk about the animated films from the 90s, which of course means we're talking about Disney. We didn't have Illumination or Blue Sky or even Sony Pictures Animation. We pretty much only had Disney and a few other assortment of films from a few other studios we'll get to in a little bit. But it was predominantly Disney, and we loved it. Disney was in the midst of its first Renaissance period, having already released their first film in the Renaissance, The Little Mermaid, in 1989. Disney had entered a shiny era of animated masterpieces. In the 90s, they would release The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mulan, and Hercules. Most of these films were quite successful and still widely regarded to this day. A few of these films spawned successful franchises. Beauty and the Beast even went on to be nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, but didn't win. But still, it was a big deal since animated films are never nominated for Best Picture. These films became the gold standard for what an animated film should be in terms of animation quality, storytelling, and music. While they were certainly the biggest name in animated films, they weren't the only studio to produce animated films. Universal released An American Tail, Fievel Goes West, and Balto. Skellington Productions, which was owned by Disney, produced A Nightmare Before Christmas and James and the Giant Peach, two stop-motion films. Warner Brothers made Space Jam, Quest for Camelot, and The Iron Giant. They also distributed Pokemon the first movie and Pokemon 2000 in the West. Fox released Anastasia. Hanna-Barbera brought their iconic character Scooby-Doo back to life with the cult classic film Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. This decade also saw some new animation studios into the fray. The Nickelodeon Channel started their own movie studio and released the Rugrats movie into theaters in 1998. We also see the birth of a new major rival for Disney, with DreamWorks Animation being founded in 1994. They won't be a major threat to the Disney empire until the next decade, but DreamWorks launched a few modest films in the 90s. They released Ants and The Prince of Egypt, both in 1998. Both films were fairly successful, but they weren't the only or even the first studio to release a fully CG animated film. That honor goes to Pixar. Pixar was technically around in the 70s, producing short films and commercials, But in 1995, in collaboration with Disney, they produced their first full-length animated film, Toy Story, which became incredibly successful. They would then release A Bug's Life and a Toy Story 2 in the 90s, also being successful films. Pixar would later go on to produce many very successful and iconic films and franchises. Disney, Pixar, and DreamWorks, three studios that either got their start or had their resurgence in the 90s, would go on to shape animated films for the decades to come. And they brought into the 90s many incredible films for us 90 kids to enjoy. But now we're done talking about animated films in the 90s, it's time to transition into our next segment, television in the 90s. Entering the 90s, animation in the television space already had many popular and iconic animated television shows, as many people consider the 80s to be the start of an animated renaissance in television, but the 90s would expand that success into the stratosphere. Before the 90s, the majority of animated programming would be aired on Saturday mornings on most networks. That tradition would continue through the 90s, but the 90s also saw the creation of new networks and programming blocks that gave kids more options for animation than ever before. Disney Channel has already been launched prior to the 90s and had been releasing cartoons like Rescue Rangers and DuckTales, but in 1990 the Disney Afternoon was launched, and many more iconic Disney cartoons would be launched in the 90s, such as Tailspin, Darkwing Duck, Goof Troop, The Little Mermaid, based on the film, Bonkers, Gargoyles, and 101 Dalmatians, the series. Later on, Disney would form ABC Kids, and with it, the programming block one Saturday morning, producing more shows for it, such as Pepper Ann, Recess, Science Court, and Mickey Mouse Works. Fox would also form Fox Kids in 1990 and release shows like Bobby's World, Tiny Toon Adventures, Tom and Jerry Kids, Tasmania, Batman the Animated Series, Eek the Cat, X-Men the Animated Series, and Animaniacs. The WB would launch their own children's animated block in 1995, Kids WB, producing Freakazoid, Pinky and the Brain, Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, Superman the Animated Series, Hysteria, and Batman Beyond. PBS launches PBS Kids in 1994. Here we get the Magic School Bus and Arthur. The 90s also saw the creation of new television cable networks devoted entirely to kids' content and thus new animated programming. Nickelodeon gained a surge of popularity in the 90s when they launched their very first Nicktoons in 1991. From them, we got many popular 90s cartoons such as Doug, Ren and Stimpy, Rugrats, Rocko's Modern Life, Real Monsters, Hey Arnold, Kablam, Angry Beavers, Cat Dog, Oh Yeah Cartoons, The Wild Thornberrys, Rocket Power, and SpongeBob SquarePants. Shortly after that, we see the creation of the first ever 24-hour animation cable channel, which played cartoons all day, every day, Cartoon Network, which launched in 1992. They originally played reruns of older cartoons such as Looney Tunes, Hanna-Barbera, and MGM Shorts, but they would then produce their own cartoons, eventually calling them Cartoon Cartoons. Among this group, we get the What a Cartoon Show, Dexter's Laboratory, Cow and Chicken, Johnny Bravo, Powerpuff Girls, Courage the Cowardly Dog, Ed, Edd and Eddy, and Mike Lewandowski. It wouldn't be the only channel devoted purely to cartoons that we get in the 90s, as Disney would launch another channel, Toon Disney, devoted completely to their animated shows, though they mainly played reruns of the shows they already produced and didn't create any new shows for this channel in this time. And of course, I didn't list every new show that came out in the 90s. The list would be too exhaustive. But clearly, we got a lot of gems in this era, many of which still stand the test of time and are enjoyed by kids to this day. In the 90s, we also see the rise of something new entering the mainstream, something that comes from across the sea. That's right, I'm talking about anime. In the 90s, American children discovered the wonders of Japanese animation, and they loved it. The Cartoon Network programming block, Toonami, as well as the Studio 4Kids, were mainly responsible for introducing Americans to English dubs of several Japanese animated shows, such as Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, Gundam Wing, and Pokemon. Pokemon, an anime based off a successful Japanese video game, became very widespread in the US in the 90s, spawning a Pokemania that became a defining feature of being a child in the 90s. Its anime is still running to this day. As you can see, the 90s brought us so many wonderful developments to the animation space. So many of the animated films and shows of this era are still enjoyed today, or have inspired new shows or films and even reboots. The studios and networks that got their start in this era are still major players in animation, creating films and shows that are massively popular today. The 90s may very well be the most important decade when it comes to animation for children, and I hope I managed to convince you that the 90s was a magnificent time to be a child. Thank you for watching this video and staying until the end. If you want to see more videos about cartoons in the 90s, be sure to subscribe to this channel because I am definitely going to be covering a lot of the movies and shows discussed in this video in more depth in future videos. Also be sure to leave a like and let me know what was your favorite animated film or show from the 90s in the comment section below. See you next time. So long.